What's up, RnB guys and gals? I'm Enrique Llorea from Enrique Llorea Productions and the RnB Way. You want to learn how to make better RnB drums, and I got your back today. Before we start, I'd like to invite you quickly to our Facebook group. It's called the RnB Way. It's a community for RnB music creators. There's all sorts of cool conversations going on there all the time. All sorts of really cool music creators. So if you make RnB or are interested in this kind of music and want to meet some cool people and have some cool conversations, make sure you join the group. The link is in the description. Let's get to it. So before we dive into it, I wanted to show you the full drum groove with every element. Here it is. I've laid out 5 different points to keep in mind when making an RnB style beat. The first one of those would be the tempo. RnB tends to be more on the slow side of things. I'd say between 70 BPM to around 110. Depending on the style of RnB, it might be closer to 70 or closer to 110. For example, NeoSoul would be more on the slower side of things, like around 70 to maybe 95. Alternative stuff would be more like around 80 to 110. Don't take this as a rule or anything, it's just what I've seen the most. Start from there and see what works for you. It can definitely be slower than that or faster than that. There are no rules, it's just what I've seen happening the most. Alright, so the next point, second point, would be sound choice. And I'd say spend a fucking good amount of time here, choosing the right sounds, test a bunch of different sounds and see what works. Because if your sounds are off, everything is gonna be off. I like to describe RnB sounds as old school hip hop with a chiller vibe, sometimes with a more alternative and weird vibe, and usually with a live feel to it. I'd say something to keep in mind for every sound would be to choose something that's not too snappy, because too snappy would probably be more on the trap side of things, and not too thick or too punchy, because that would be more on the pop side. Somewhere in between is a good balance. So for kicks, I usually like to go for something that's fat, that's boomy, that's got a little dirt, a little attitude to it, and that's not too punchy or snappy, like I said. So here's my main kick sample. It's got that nice body, nice fatness with a little click, but it's not like a harsh click like you get in pop or in trap. It's more like an old school kind of click. And for my second kick, I used a wider kick to give it a little more space. Here's the wide kick. It might sound a little weird on its own, but here's how both of the kicks sound combined. So you get that nice body from the first one, nice and thick, and then from the second one you get like a little room, a little width. In RnB tunes, the drums and the beat in general are usually pretty minimalistic, so I just like to have the kick cover a little more of the stereo spectrum, just to make it sound a little fuller. Then for snares, depending on the vibe you're going for, you might want to use something like a rim shot, or snaps, or claps, or something that's more like a real snare. For this one, since it's a little more on the alternative side, I went for something that's more like a real snare. But if you're making, let's say, NeoSoul, you may want to lean towards something like a rim, or a snap, or a clap, where it's a little chiller, less hard-hitting. Just let it carry that vibe well. So here's my first snare. It's kind of like a rim shot with a little extra dirt to it, and like a little delay to the sides or something sounding on the sides a little later. And I think that's really cool to make the snare a little longer. And my second snare is this one. So it's more like a real snare, more hard hitting, more aggressive. And when they're both combined, they sound like this. I think it's really cool to layer different samples and make them sound at the same time, because you can get the best of both worlds. Here I'm getting that thickness from the second snare, but I'm getting the vibe, the dirt, and the width from the first one. Just make sure that when you're layering stuff, you're being really intentional about it and you're choosing samples for a purpose. Here, I just explained why I chose them. Don't just choose a bunch of samples that sound cool and put them on top of each other, because you're probably gonna get a hot mess of sounds. Then for hi-hats, I found that R&B tends to lean towards either live feel hi-hats or organic and weird hi-hats. And here's what I mean by that. So on the live feel, it's gonna be something that sounds close to what a real hi-hat sounds, or maybe even just a real hi-hat sample. And on the organic side, it's usually a sampled percussion that sounds interesting and weird and cool, and it's used as a hi-hat, super vibey. An example of that would be just taking any percussion thing or hitting any surface, sampling it, and using it as a hi-hat. So here what I got is a closed hi-hat sample that sounds kind of like a real hi-hat. It's a little synthetic, which I think is cool. It's not 100% live, so it still retains that kind of alternative and poppy sound to it without being too artificial. And then my second hi-hat is an open hi-hat, and it's just a real hi-hat sample. And when they're combined in different ways, they sound pretty cool. Check it out. So yeah, the open one is just doing some accents, and it's pretty cool. Then for claps and snaps, I usually like to go for stuff that has a bit of that live feel to it, that's laid back. Here's what I mean by laid back. It's just snaps and claps have different hits, right? It's not just one snap. It's usually 2 snaps or 3 or whatever. I like to have a lot of those in there just to make each hit a little longer and not as tight to the grid. And I also like them to be either soft and nice, maybe for NeoSoul style stuff, or even alternative, or gritty and with some attitude, old school hip hop style. Combining those is really cool. I just don't want anything that's super snappy or super harsh. That would be more on the trap side again, or on the pop side. Just want to keep it nice and live, sometimes with a little extra grit, sometimes just feeling a little more natural. Here's what I got for those. So definitely a combination of some live feel and some extra hip hop grit. And I also have these 2 tracks of real snaps that I recorded. Just put my mic, recorded some snaps, put one to the left, one to the right, added some reverb, and they sound like this. They also got some distortion and some vibe effects going on. And I think it's really nice to have these layered with samples. You definitely get that live feel with some attitude going on. And our last point for sound choice would be noise. I think noise is a fucking awesome thing to use in R&B tunes. I see it being used a lot to give it that kind of old school hip hop vibe or that lo-fi vibe. Just feels really nice, warm, analog, vibey. And for noise samples, I tend to lean towards tape noise or vinyl crackle. I think that's kind of the standard thing to use in R&B. White noise or pink noise tend to be a little more harsh and hard to deal with. Here's what those sound like, and I'll explain what's going on with the sidechaining a little later. So it's nice and smooth and just gives it a little extra vibe. Third point, the groove. This is why you all came here. All right. So in R&B, we have all sorts of grooves, but I think this groove is like a general vibe that covers a lot of different things. I'd say a lot of R&B grooves are based on old school hip hop grooves with a bit more of a laid back feel, that kind of Dilla drunk groove. So here's the main groove again, in case you forgot it. Let's talk about each part. So the kicks, I have the 2 layers going on all the time. I'm also playing some little doubles just to give it a little extra attitude, like here. That's super common and it's really cool. And when you're doing doubles and this kind of stuff, you want to bring the velocity of the one that comes before the main one down, so that it doesn't just all sound at the same level. It's going to sound super artificial. That's not how a real drummer would play it. Keep the live feel in mind at all times and you'll be good. So we have that main double pattern going on, and then a little later in the beat, I added a little variation to it. Just again, live feel, variations make it feel like it's alive. So here's that variation. It's right here. It's this one. Check it out. It's like call and response. R&B is also very heavily based on the blues, and the blues is all about call and response. So if you can vary the calls and the responses every now and then, good for you. That's pretty much what's going on with the kick. Just hitting on the main beats, some little doubles to accentuate stuff, bring the velocity down, and then vary those doubles or those extra accents throughout the beat. Then for snares, I kept it super simple with this one, but you can always play around and do different accents with the snares. I'm just using both snare samples on the 2 and 4 all the time because I'm doing some stuff with the claps and the snaps and some extra little effects to give it more movement. I didn't find that it was necessary in this beat to vary the snares too much, but it's always nice to vary them around. Here's an example of what a variation on the snares could look like. So here's the main beat, and then I'm gonna vary it. So I would take my snare samples and just put them right here, bring the velocity down a little, just to give it a little extra snare hit. Check it out. Then just move it a little off the grid to make it feel more live. You get the idea, just move it around until it's sounding cool. It's always nice to have those little snare variations. I just didn't find it very necessary for this beat. And then hi-hats. This is where the magic is, okay? So if you see my kicks and my snares, they're all pretty much on the beat, except for the doubles. They're a little off just to give them an extra swing. But then the hi-hats, they're all over the place, right? There's like no real repetition going on because each one is just slightly off the grid in a different way. And that's exactly what we want to achieve with the hi-hats. With the hi-hats, what you usually want to achieve in R&B is a laid-back feel. And the way to get this laid-back feel is just to move all the MIDI a little to the right. However, if you just draw in hi-hats that are perfectly aligned to the beat and then move all of them a little to the right, you're not going to get that feel because a real drummer wouldn't play it that way. A real drummer is gonna vary his time. We're human. We can't play like machines. So that's what I'm aiming for here. I played out a hi-hat pattern on my MIDI keyboard, quantized it a little, and then just manually moved each one a little later to the point where it felt right, and then varied all the velocities. What I'm doing with the velocities is that all the hi-hat hits that are on the upbeats are being played louder than the ones that are on the downbeats. Check it out. We're getting that. It doesn't have to be this way, but it's definitely important to play around with the velocities to get that kind of live feel. If all the hi-hats are at the same level, it's not gonna sound great. And just to prove that to you, here's how the hi-hats would sound if they were all at the same velocity and quantized perfectly to the beat. It's not bad, but it doesn't have a lot of attitude. Here's something super important to keep in mind when you're moving your hi-hats around. Anytime you have a hi-hat that goes at the same time as the snare, you want to make it sound like a flam. A flam, for those of you who aren't drummers, I'm not a drummer, but I just happen to know the term, is basically this. Not one hit, 2 hits that are almost at the same time. That kind of thing. So you want to have that kind of action happening between your hats and your snare. So just make it come a little before or a little after. That's going to give it a really nice bounce. And finally, for hats, as you probably heard, I have the open hi-hat going on at the end of each phrase. That's just a cool thing to do. It's something that a lot of drummers do, so might as well keep it in mind. Play it like a real drummer would. You can also add these open hats at different points of the song. They don't have to be at the end of every phrase. Here, I'll just move a couple of them around and see what we get. Could be interesting to just move them randomly. Sounds cool. Move it around, see what works. That's it for the drum groove. Also worth mentioning that I did a 4-bar drum loop and then just loop that throughout the beat. You could also take the second repetition of that and vary some stuff just to make it a little more interesting. But for this one, since we're going for a pretty straight up alternative R&B feel, I'm just looping that. There's usually not a ton of variation going on in alternative R&B. I'd say there's a lot more variation in NeoSoul, but do whatever works for you. If you vary some stuff and it sounds cool, good for you. All right, so point 4, let's talk percussions. First, let's check out the claps. So for the claps, what I usually like to do is to have some sort of variation as well. So I like to have a smaller clap hit first, and then one that's a little bigger, a little wider, just to give it a little more impact on that second and fourth hit. Check it out. And then I just repeat that throughout the beat. It's a nice way of bringing some variation and movement to the claps instead of using the same sample all the time. That can get a little too repetitive and boring. So it's just a nice way to spice it up, nothing complicated. Keep in mind the intention. I like to make the first one smaller, second one bigger to have more impact. Do whatever works for you, but have a clear intention for it. And then for my last clap hit of the 4-bar loop, I just used the second one, the bigger sounding one, and added some reverb to it just to give it a little more impact before the loop starts again. Pretty cool way of varying it up so that it's not the same 2 samples all the time, just a little more variation and impact. Then for snaps, it's the same idea. What I did here is have the snaps playing when the claps are not playing. So I have a snap hit, then a clap, then a different snap, and then a different clap. Here's what it sounds like with only the snaps. It's the same idea as with the claps. My first snap hit is a little snappier, a little less full, and the second one is a little fuller, a little wider, a little thicker. And here's what it sounds like with the snaps and the claps playing their call and response. Now the reverb. Pretty cool interplay between those. Nothing complicated, but it makes a huge difference. And then I also like adding some swooshes, and here's what I mean by those. It's this sound right here. And then here. It's just like a reverse kind of thing that leads really nicely into the next snare hit. And I like using those for the harder hits, so I'm using it right before the big clap, and then I'm using 2 of those right before the reverb clap. So it adds up a nice bit of anticipation before that big hit. For swooshes, any sort of reversed sound will work fine. A reversed crash or snare with a reverb or anything like that. Just something that builds it up and then releases totally once the hit happens. And as you probably noticed, I have some variation going on with those. So first we have just this one. And then I have the same one with the little extra layer. 2 swooshes, just to change it up right before the loop ends. Last thing on percussion, if you have some cool percussion instruments lying around, or if you don't, also cool, try recording some stuff, just like hitting stuff around your house. Keep in mind that when you're sampling random stuff, both the object that you're hitting and the object that you're hitting it with are going to be super important. So if you hit a desk with your nails, it's going to sound way different than if you hit it with a stick or with a shoe. You get the idea. So experiment with different surfaces and different materials for hitting this stuff. You can find some really nice sounds from this. It's nice to have those little extra layers of sounds that are a little more unpredictable. And it doesn't even have to be hitting stuff. It can be like shaking stuff or rubbing against stuff, like rubbing this can probably give you like a good shaker, you know? Just experiment with a bunch of stuff that you may have lying around, make it sound in different ways, and be creative. And our last point, point number 5, is noise. And here's what I did with my noise. I have one noise sample on the middle, and it just has kickstart doing like a little side chaining. It's sounding on the offbeats a little later than the offbeat, and it's really cool. It just gives it a little extra laid back feel. And then on the sides, I also use kickstart in a different way. It's going like this. So it's basically hitting at the same time as the kick, as every downbeat. It's like, and then the one in the middle is doing. So it's a really nice counterpoint between those. You get the sides going at the same time as the kick, and then the middle going up in the offbeat. It's a really nice way of adding extra rhythm without having to use rhythmic elements or stuff that really stands out. It's just there in the background, but makes a big difference. Here's without. It's alright, but here's the noise. Here's the vibe. It's something that a regular music listener wouldn't even notice. Maybe even a lot of producers wouldn't notice it if it's like tucked in the background. But having it there gives it a little extra oomph, a little extra rhythm, and it's a really nice thing to do. So just play around with sidechaining different noises. It's a really cool thing to do. Try sidechaining it to the kick or to the hat, or just using something like kickstart to get different rhythms. Really cool thing to do. Alright, that's it for today. Hope you learned a lot. Hope it was good stuff. And if you enjoyed this video, go like, comment, subscribe. Really helps out the channel. And make sure to join our Facebook group, the RnB Way. The link is in the description below. Thanks again and have a good one.